We now learn a little more about the multiplication formula for radicals. Remember, we saw for square roots that the product of square root of a times the square root of b equals to the square root of the product a times b. And so to see how this is actually used, we're going to work through some examples. The first example, I'll just write example 1. Let's see how to simplify the square root of 2 times the square root of 7. Well, using this formula we have here, we can go right ahead and say that this equals to the square root of 2 times 7. And that equals to the square root of 14. And we're done. Another example, example 2, would be 3 times root 2 times the square root of 5. Well, the first thing I want to draw our attention towards here is that when we write 3 root 2, it means 3 times root 2. In other words, this is equal to 3 times the square root of 2 times the square root of 5. Now that we've done that, we can focus on these two terms in the multiplication that I've just underlined in green and use our formula for multiplication of radicals to write that this equals to 3 times the square root of 2 times 5. That's equal to 3 times the square root of 10, and finally we can state that that's equal to 3 root 10. And we're done. Let's look at a couple more examples. Example 3, say we have to simplify the square root of 2 times, in parentheses, the square root of 5 plus the square root of 3. Well, the key thing to realize here is that even though we're dealing with square roots or radicals, the rules that we already know for distribution and expansion do not change. In other words, all we have to do here is distribute this square root of 2 across these parentheses. So that would equal to the following. We start with square root of 2 times square root of 5, so I'll just write that. That's square root of 2 times the square root of 5 plus the square root of 2 times the square root of 3. Now that we've written all the terms in the expansion, we can go ahead and simplify as much as possible. So we have square root of 2 times square root of 5 and square root of 2 times square root of 3. So using our formula, we find that it's equal to the square root of 2 times 5 plus the square root of 2 times 3. Finally, we can state that that's equal to the square root of 10 plus the square root of 6. And we stop there. Remember, there is no rule for adding 2 square roots or 2 radicals. We cannot simplify this any further. So this would be our final answer here. Let's look at one last example. As a final example, example 4, we look into writing all the terms in the expansion of the square root of 5 minus the square root of 3 times the square root of 2 plus the square root of 7. Well, again, the key thing to keep in mind here is that the usual rules of expansion and distribution still apply here. Don't let the fact that we have square roots put you off in any way. So to write all the terms of this expansion, we use exactly the same method as we would to write all the terms in the expansion of a plus b times c plus d. And many of you may have heard of the method FOIL, where the F stands for the firsts, the O stands for the outers, the I stands for the inners, and the L stands for the lasts. If you haven't seen that before, don't worry, the method's going to be explained right now. The first thing I'm going to do here is clarify what is meant by this minus sign in between the square root of 5 and the square root of 3. And to do that, I'll rewrite this first parentheses as follows. This is equal to the square root of 5 plus negative square root of 3 in parentheses, all of which is multiplying the square root of 2 plus the square root of 7. Even though this may seem like a little bit of extra work for not much, trust me when I say that adding this extra step in the working will save you from sign errors somewhere along the line. Now that we've done that, we can go ahead and write all the terms of the expansion using FOIL. Indeed, we can go ahead and state that this equals to the product of the firsts, so the first of each of the parentheses are square root of 5 and square root of 2, So that's square root of 5 times the square root of 2. We add to that the product of the outers. So the outers would be the square root of 5 and the square root of 7. So that's square root of 5 times the square root of 7. We now add to that the product of the inners. And so that would correspond to negative root 3 times root 2. So that's negative square root of 3 times the square root of 2. And finally, we add to that the product of the last terms in each of the two parentheses. So that's negative square root of 3 times the square root of 7. Now, before using our formula for the product of two square roots, let's just tidy up these negative signs here. So the first two terms will be unchanged. We have the square root of 5 times the square root of 2 plus the square root of 5 times the square root of 7. And then we're adding negative square root of 3 times root 2. And since the product negative square root of 3 times the square root of 2 will be negative, we can write this as minus the square root of 3 times the square root of 2. Doing the same for negative square root of 3 times the square root of 7, we have minus the square root of 3 times the square root of 7. We're now all set to go ahead and use our formula. Remember, that was the square root of a times the square root of b equals to the square root of a times b. That leads us to the square root of 5 times 2 plus the square root of 5 times 7 minus the square root of 3 times 2 minus the square root of 3 times 7. Finally, that's equal to the square root of 10 plus the square root of 35 minus the square root of 6 minus the square root of 21. And we're done. We cannot simplify this any further. And so that's how we can use this formula for the product of two radicals, and in particular, as we saw here, the product of two square roots. And that's it for this tutorial. There we go, everyone. I really hope that helped, and if it did, please hit like on this video and even subscribe to our channel, because that really does help us. I'll see you soon.